I just want to thank Igal. Is it correct, my pronunciation?
Yes, Igal.
Okay, Igal. I try to pronounce your family name, Berenshtein, something like, sounds me German. Anyway.
Yeah,
Igal
originally it's German, yeah.
Yeah, Berenshtein, who is presently at Miami University, in a very important school for marine science in general. And I've been visiting this school many years ago. It sounds many years ago because it was before COVID time. And it's very, let me say, number one school in marine science, all aspects of marine science. And of course, as you all know, some years ago, it was, I don't remember exactly, there was this big accident. I don't remember, but we've been active in that accident. There was a big accident in the Gulf of Mexico that actually was even, unfortunately, or fortunately, it depends what the point of view is, it was a big challenge for all scientists. Because, of course, it was so gigantic, that oil spill, that former, let me say, technique or idea or whatever had to be changed and to be adapted to this gigantic oil spill. In fact, you cannot categorize or classify into former other oil spill happened. And just let me say a few words about Igal. It's easier, so I play easier. He's a marine ecologist, and of course, as you understand, one of the components to deal with the oil spill is, of course, the environmental side. It's not only, let me say, technical, hydraulic, whatever, but there are many competence, many skills that have to be used when you have a real problem such like this. And of course, you have some remote sensing guys. You have some, and in that school there is even a center for remote sensing.
That's
I
right.
don't know. And but you have to even deal with some delicate choice. And just a premise to you. For example, how much and which kind of dispersant you may like to use, which are kind of something, let me say, chemical that breaks the film of oil, but is not so healthy for the environment. So it's kind of balance. And of course, for this, it's very important in the team, let me say, that you have the ecologists and so on. And today, I give you the words, we have the pleasure and the honor to have Igal Berenshtein discussing about the Gulf of Mexico oil spill accident, which was a challenging test. We hope to don't have many other times, but it's still a matter of investigation after so many years, both on the remote sensing side, on the ecological side. There was a very famous paper about Valentine on long-term effects. Okay, so it's like a very, very important experiments, let me say, that we still have to understand for future accident. We hope not happens, but you never know. And I don't want to waste more time, and I give the word to Igal Berenshtein to start this seminar. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Maurizio. And this is indeed true. It's a complex problem, four-dimensional problem with many, many aspects. And I will talk a little bit about that in my presentation. Let's see just that you can see my screen. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, perfect.
Yes.
Yeah, today I will talk about the effect of oil spills on the marine environment and on coastal population using a quantitative interdisciplinary approach. So just a brief history of what I've been doing and where I come from. So I did my PhD working on larval dispersal and connectivity, biophysical modeling, larval orientation, and from there, and that was in Israel in Ben Gurion University. From there, I went on to work on marine pollution during my first postdoc at the Rosenstiel School of Marine Atmospheric Science in Miami. After that, I moved on to work on ecosystem modeling in the Gulf of Mexico during my second postdoc and assistant scientist position. And next year, I will start a position as an assistant professor at the University of Haifa in Israel. And in this talk today, I will focus on the work done during my first postdoc, working on marine pollution, primarily in the Gulf of Mexico. And I will first want to acknowledge some key personnel, key people in this work. So Claire Paris, who was my first postdoc advisor and a mentor, and in her lab, the oil CMS, oil transport and fate model, was developed, and she is a PI on two main funded projects funded by the National Academy of Sciences and the Sea Image 3 Consortium, which is under the umbrella of the Gulf of Mexico Research Initiative. And also I want to acknowledge Steve Muravsky, who is the main PI of both of these projects, as well as scientists from Claire Paris's lab, Anna Vaz, Natalie Perlin, and Robin Filetas, who worked on developing the oil CMS model and the products associated with it. I would also like to acknowledge various collaborators that contributed to the development of the model and the associated projects from various institutes in the US and in Europe and in West Australia. And so why is it important to study large-scale ecological processes in the marine environment? So our life, as we know it, is completely dependent on healthy oceans for clean air, for drinking water through desalination. The oceans regulate our temperature, the temperature. It takes in carbon dioxide. It includes hundreds of thousands of marine species, and it provides a livelihood and nutrition to millions of people in coastal population around the world. But this important asset, this critical asset, which once seemed infinite, is quickly deteriorating due to marine pollution, due to climate change, and overfishing. And in this talk, I will focus on the aspect of marine pollution. And so I will give you a brief overview of the talk. I will first talk about the Deepwater Horizon oil spill and the invisible and toxic oil that we found was part of the spill. I will then talk about the effect of fishery closures on fishery-dependent communities. I will tell you about a computational framework that is able to compare potential oil spill scenarios in the Gulf of Mexico. And I will briefly talk about the Israeli oil spill that occurred a year ago. I will then summarize and conclude the talk. And so during my first postdoc, I worked on the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. It was one of the largest marine oil spills globally. It released more than 200 million gallons of crude oil to the Gulf of Mexico. It lasted for more than 87 days. It contaminated vast areas of the Gulf of Mexico, killing enormous amount of marine wildlife, fish, invertebrates, marine mammals. It harmed coastal habitats, and even to this day, some of these areas are closed due to this spill. And so as a marine ecologist, my first question when starting to work on this oil spill was, what was the spatial extent of this spill? And when I asked this question, the answer I kept receiving is the satellite footprint detected by satellites or visually or from planes. And this was considered the spatial extent of the spill. And so then I asked, does the satellite footprint, or what was visually identified, accounts for the entire oil spill? And to answer this question, I used three main sources of information. More than 40,000 in-situ water and sediment samples, independent published field studies that examined the occurrence of oil in the Gulf of Mexico, and an oil transport and fate model developed in the Claire Paris lab. And I will briefly define two types of concentration, which I will talk about. TPH, total petroleum hydrocarbons, which represents the crude oil, and the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon, PAH, which represents the fraction that is mostly associated with oil toxicity. And so what we found, so from the left in red color, you can see the cumulative satellite footprint of the oil spill. And what you see in yellow dashed line is the fishery closures that applied based on the location of the spill detected by satellites and based on where they thought the oil would get to. And on the right-hand side, you can see these three sources of information that I mentioned. So the different colors here are the results of the oil spill model, the oil transport model. And also hot, like red colors represents high concentrations, and blue and purple colors represents low concentrations. What you can see in red dots are in situ water and sediment samples that were with concentrations above the background level. And what you can see in red crosses are independent studies that indicated the presence of oil in these regions. And what we can see clearly from these three types of information is that the oil spill, according to these three types of informations, exceeded beyond what was captured by the satellites and beyond the fishery closures. But then I ask, well, maybe it doesn't matter. I mean, if that portion that exceeded beyond the satellite footprint and the fishery closures was not toxic to marine wildlife, then we should not care about it. So my next question was to ask, what was that extended portion toxic to marine life? And first I wanted to compute the satellite visibility threshold. And basically what we did is to look at the time period for after the satellites did not identify any oil slicks after the spill was capped. So what you see on the upper plot is the area detected by the satellite, the area of slicks detected by satellites. And what you see on the lower panel is the in situ measurements that were measured in the water during the spill. And what we can see is that after the spill was capped, there was a decline of the satellite footprint, and then at a certain point in time, there was no longer identification of oil slicks by the satellites. But at the same time, the in situ measurements indicate that there were high concentrations of oil in these areas, which are which are considerably higher than the toxicity threshold. So in order to compute the visibility threshold of the satellites, what I did is I averaged the highest measurements during that period, and basically below that threshold, if concentration is below that threshold, satellites can no longer identify the oil slick. So this is one threshold, the visibility threshold of the satellites. The other threshold adopted from a governmental impact report is the oil toxicity threshold. And so these two thresholds allowed me to divide the spill into three meaningful portions.
Can you hide the Meet Google banner so we can see?
What?
We see a banner of the meetgoogle.com saying that hide.
Oh, okay, okay, yeah.
So we can see the second figure.
Okay, thank you. Can you see it now?
Yes, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. So, so this allowed me to divide the spill into three meaningful portions: visible and toxic, invisible and toxic, and invisible and non-toxic. And when we plug in these three portions or these two thresholds to the oil spill model, we get this left map. So the brown color is visible and toxic, the yellow color is invisible and toxic, and the blue color is non-toxic and invisible. And so we can see that toxic concentrations indeed extended beyond the satellite footprint and beyond the fishery closures. And what's interesting is that what causes these very low toxicity threshold is an effect called photo-enhanced toxicity, which is the combined effect of oil toxicity and UV radiation. And if we just consider oil toxicity alone, then the toxicity threshold and the visible threshold will be fairly similar. And this combined effect of oil toxicity and UV radiation actually can create 100 times more toxic effect than oil toxicity alone. And these toxic concentrations are especially toxic to early life stages of fish and invertebrates. The other thing we can see is that when we look at the toxic and visible portion of the spill, it resembles in shape and in size to the identified oil slicks, cumulative oil slicks, which is applicative to simulate future spills or past spills and to simulate the area that the satellite will identify. And this was published in Science Advanced, and it really it was covered in many news networks because it really made us look at the Deepwater Horizon in a new kind of approach. But unfortunately, the effect of oil spill is not limited only to the number of animals killed due to the toxic concentration, and it has many more different effects on the ecosystem and on coastal populations. And one of these effects is related to the effect of fishery closures on fishery-dependent communities. And what happens is that during the spill, there was a lot of economical damage to fisheries, estimated in billions of dollars. And about 20% of that damage is associated to fishery closures, which are the areas closed for fishing due to the risk of seafood contamination and fishers and looking after fishers' safety. But this impact on fishery-dependent communities differs between the socioeconomic status of each community, meaning that if a certain community is socially vulnerable, then the impact can be more severe compared to a non-vulnerable community, which is also not highly dependent on fisheries. So what we did in this study is we developed a quantitative framework to understand the possible impacts of oil spill on fishery-dependent communities in the Gulf of Mexico. And we used three main sources of information: the 3D oil spill modeling, commercial fishing data analysis, and the social vulnerability index, which looks at various parameters such as family structure, the development state of the community, infrastructure, etc. And more specifically, what we did, we used fisheries observer data and location together with fishing vessel movement data, and we mapped the fishing locations in the Gulf of Mexico. Then we used potential or hypothetical oil spill data and applied automatic fishery closures based on toxic concentration to produce these polygons that represents the potential closures of fishing in case of a spill. From these two sources of information, we computed the lost fishing locations, and together with data from fisheries logbooks, we computed the potential lost revenue at the county level. Then together with the social vulnerability index, we could compute the impact on the fishery-dependent communities at the county level, considering their social vulnerability state. And this allowed us to map, the counties that are going to lose a lot of revenue due to fishery closures, but also considering their social vulnerability. So what you can see in red, the red counties marked here represents counties that are going to lose a lot of revenue due to the closure, but they're also socially vulnerable. And this can be helpful for management and for future planning of oil spill mitigation. And similarly, oil spills such as the Deepwater Horizon, they are complex four-dimensional problems. They occur at the surface, at the water column. There is a deep plume. Some of the oil sinks to the sediment. Some of the oil reaches the shore. And it's pretty difficult to compare complex spills such as that. So what we did in this project is to compute a quantitative framework for comparing complex oil spills such as the Deepwater Horizon. So we used the RSMAS as the oil spill model, transport model, and we used the Atlantis ecosystem model to compute the impact on the marine ecosystem. And together and using synthesis and post-processing, we were able to effectively compare between different scenarios. So specifically, the variables that we looked at are the total volume impacted by the spill, the toxic volume, the volume impacted by toxic concentration, the total area impacted by the spill, the area impacted by toxic concentration, the mass, the oil mass that was sedimented, the oil mass that reached the shore, the length of the impacted coastline, as well as ecosystem variables such as the minimum biomass due to the spill, the years it took the ecosystem to recover, and the net biomass change after 20 years. And we used four scenarios in the Gulf of Mexico. So the control is basically the Deepwater Horizon. The fall scenario represents the Deepwater Horizon, but occurring during the fall instead of during the spring. The East GOM scenario represents a spill occurring in the eastern Gulf of Mexico, and the West GOM scenario represents spill occurring at the western Gulf of Mexico. The upper plots represents the cumulative concentrations in the water, and the lower plots represents the cumulative sedimented mass, oil mass that sank to the bottom. And so what you can see at first glance is that the scenarios are comparable. They are the same order of magnitude, even though there is some variation. So both in the sedimented mass and in the water cumulative concentrations. And if we dive more into the details, we can look at the cumulative time series. And so what we see in blue is the control, the red is the false scenario, the brown is the Eastern GOM scenario, and the purple is the Western GOM scenario. And we can see the dynamics during the simulation. And we can also see that there is no single scenario that is either the most impactful or the least impactful. There is variation between the different variables. And then we can summarize this data into by ranking the severity of the spill of the scenarios per each variable. So red and high number represents severe, and green and low number like 1 represents not severe. And what we can see is that the scenarios are comparable. And there's no single scenario that is always the most severe or always the least severe. But we can still see that, for example, the Eastern GOM has the highest score, meaning that a spill scenario occurring at the Eastern Gulf of Mexico will be probably in total more impactful than, for example, a spill occurring at the Western Gulf of Mexico. And what we can also do is look at the correlation between the different variables or the trade-off. So it makes sense, for example, that there is a correlation between the sedimented, the beached mass and the shoreline length that was impacted by the oil spill. So the number here is the correlation coefficient between the different variables. And for example, there is a negative correlation between beached mass and oil volume, and that makes sense because oil that reached the shore will not be in the water column, and therefore the volume of the water that will be impacted by the oil will be smaller. And so this allows us to kind of have a general view at the dynamics and provide some meaningful insight within this complex problem. And this was published as a chapter in the book Scenarios and Response to Future Deep Oil Spills. And we used a similar approach to look at possible oil spill beyond the Gulf of Mexico, one in Cuba and one in West Africa, in Senegal. And we can see the size and the effect of these possible oil spills, which is immense. And that was also published in that book as a separate chapter. And I will talk a little bit about the spill that we had a year ago in Israel. And what allowed us to reconstruct this spill is a different project in which we compute connectivity, larval connectivity between proposed marine protected areas in the eastern Gulf, in the eastern Mediterranean. And so we had the oceanographic data for that region. And then when that spill happened, it was fairly easy for us to reconstruct the spill. And we collaborated with researchers from Reichman University, Tel Aviv University, the Israeli Meteorological Service to compute the spill. So we identified the oil slick location during February 11 last year. And from that oil slick location, we modeled forward in time the spill dynamics, and again computed the oil concentration in time and space, both in the water and what was sank to the sediment and what reached the shore, and that fitted well with what was observed in the field. So during that spill last year, the entire coast of Israel and some of the Lebanoni coast were contaminated by tar and by oil, and this reconstruct the spill. And what we have recently completed a manuscript that calculates the economical impact of that spill, and I will be working on a manuscript that computes the ecological impact of that spill. So what you can see is that the spill overlaps with marine protected areas and with rocky reefs, areas which harbors more biodiversity, and this, together with larval abundance and connectivity, have to be considered when we talk about the impact of that spill. And so to summarize, the scientific world realized that oil spills are complex events that are not only limited to the oil transport itself, but they contain physical, biogeochemical components, biological components, economical components, and physical health components. And what we did in the projects I presented here is to quantitatively connect different aspects of these separate components related to the physical and biogeochemical component, as well as the toxicity and the impact on fisheries and impact of the closures on seafood harvest and on the income and employment of fishery-dependent communities. And this is an important step into a better and holistic understanding of such complex events such as the Deepwater Horizon oil spill. And in the Eastern Mediterranean, we have a very crowded sea with a lot of anthropogenic impacts, including oil and gas rigs, as well as terrestrial runoff. And the spill is not only the pollution is not only limited to that spill that I presented. These are chronic pollutions that we need to consider, and of course, an event such as the Deepwater Horizon or an event such as the Empty Haven that occurred in Italy in 1991 can reoccur and contaminate entire regions in the Mediterranean. And of course, the event occurred last year is a good reminder and a good lesson for us to be prepared for such event. And actually, only yesterday, there was an identification of an oil slick in front of Israel, and we're still not sure if it's going to, if it is indeed oil, and if it's going to contaminate the shore. And so this is events that are frequent and abundant, and we need to be able to account for them both environmentally and economically. So if we look at the Mediterranean as a whole, it accounts for, although it accounts for less than 1% of the ocean area, it encompasses 15% of marine shipping traffic. It is very dense in marine shipping traffic. And with the traffic, there is, of course, oil spill events, which are very abundant across especially the northern and the eastern Mediterranean. And we need to be able to account for this pollution. So if we want to study the Mediterranean ecosystem, we cannot ignore this chronic and severe pollution. We have to take that into consideration. And hopefully, what we need to do as scientists is to collaborate with so engineers like you, with marine ecologists and marine ecosystem science, to form collaborative frameworks to be able to answer two fundamental goals. One is to quantify the effect of marine pollution on the marine environment, and the second is to quantify the effect of marine pollution on coastal human population. And this is critically important given the anthropogenic development, the increase in oil-related activities, and the high toxicity of high impact and high toxicity of oil pollution, which is currently not accounted for properly. With this, I would like to thank you for listening. I would like to thank you for inviting me to give this talk. I would like to acknowledge all the collaborators in the different projects and the funding agencies, and especially Claire Paris, Steve Murawski, and Natalie Perlin, who were instrumental in leading and contributing to these projects. And with this, I'll be happy to, I'll thank you again for listening, and I'll be happy to take any questions.
Thank you very much, Igal. It was very, very interesting seminar about many aspects. I have a first question, but I invite all the audience to make question. Of course, when you compare the analysis, let me say satellite-based and on ground, you didn't, of course, it was obvious, give too much details about the both techniques, and it would be nice to learn something very, very general, at least, about the remote sensing activity or idea monitoring one, and of course the in situ one, because of course when you say the level, for example, I remember the one of the key graph that I asked you to show the lower part.
Yeah.
Of course, this comparison is always dependent on the technique you use, because of course the sensitivity of the different techniques or procedure or instruments at the end is different. That's, I just want to comment. I mean, give some more insight. I don't want to take all your time, but
no, that's fine. That's a good question. So basically, the what I call the remote sensing is not only remote sensing, is mainly the SAR satellites, but it's also airplanes that flew above the area and identified visually slicks, and visual identification from boats. So they combined these sources of information, and they created what they call nest disanomaly polygons. So they have like daily polygons where oil was detected in either of these techniques, but
even in the Israel case, also in the Israel case.
So in the Israeli case, it was only the SAR identification for that day. There were different days, so a few days before there's a different technique. I think it's just like the multispectral imagery, but for that specific date, I think the multispectral imagery was not available, and they used SAR. And I actually also used the satellite data to find that slick and validated that this is indeed the shape and the size of that slick for that day. So it's it's from Copernicus. It's the Sentinel-1 SAR VV polarization. I think it's what's normally used for oil slick detection.
So single pole analysis.
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
What about the on site?
So on site in the so we didn't have anything for the Mediterranean spill. There wasn't any measurements, but for what I presented for the Gulf of Mexico, there were in-situ samples. So they deployed the Niskin bottles. They took water samples and they sent it to the lab to do gas chromatography and mass spectrometry to measure the total petroleum hydrocarbon concentration and the polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbon concentration. So there's like a huge database. There were like probably tens of ships that took part in this immense
sampling, let me say.
Yeah,
it's a real sampling, you're saying.
Yes, it's sampling. It's real sampling. It's not remote sensing. It's real sampling, and yeah, and I think, and that's for the what we call the Gulf science data. That was these 40,000 water and sediment samples, and these independent studies. So each used a slightly different technique. Some used measurements. There were like various techniques, but the bottom line is that these techniques indicated the presence of oil at these locations. So I mark them as crosses, but they use different techniques, and some were at the beach, some were at the sediment, some were at the water column, some did fingerprinting, so they identified the exact structure of the Macondo oil to make sure that this is indeed oil from the Deepwater Horizon. So there's a variability in these independent studies.
Okay, I understand. Any other question, comments?
I have a question. Are you there?
Oh, Andre.
Hi, Igal. Nice to meet you. Very, very interesting presentation.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Just a curiosity about the recent oil spillage that happened in Thailand. There were another water pipeline that released a lot of oil over there. Do you have some updated information? I know it's far away from the Gulf of Mexico, but
no, I actually didn't look too much on that spill. I was kind of I looked at some spills that occurred in the past years, but not specifically on that spill. But I don't know. Do you have like a specific question?
no, since the phenomenology of the oil spill is very similar to the Deepwater Horizon, since it was a broken underwater pipeline. So it was interesting to compare after almost 12 years if some advancement in the use of both ground remediation activities and the support of satellite measurement, it was improved in the last decade.
Yeah, so I don't have too much information about that. Do you know what's the depth of that spill?
I read something, but there are from the news online journals, but they say very different numbers. So I think it's not an official source of information up to now.
So there's a big difference in like ultra deep spills and ones that are occurring fairly shallow. So, for example, there was the Ixtoc spill that occurred in 1979 in the Gulf of Mexico as well, but that was in a depth of 60 meters, and in that spill, all the oil, like most of the majority of the oil, just went up to the surface and then transported to the area of Texas and the rest of the U.S. Gulf states. And so that is a fundamentally different spill than the Deepwater Horizon, which was like at the depth of, if I remember correctly, it was 1,500 or something like that, very deep. And so for these conditions, because they're like a very high pressure underwater, then much of the oil is captured in depth. So there was like a deep plume in 1,200 meters that was very wide and very long, and that was something that was discovered during the Deepwater Horizon, and it is very unique. It will not occur in a shallow spill. So that is kind of that's why I asked for the depth of the spill. So there's a lot of difference if the spill is very, very deep.
Okay. Thank you, Igal.
Thank you.
Even for the temperature,
Yes.
Of course, this is a challenging task. Anyway, whatever is the remote sensing activity, which is the sampling activity, or I understand what you say. If you operate not in scientific terms, in some way supporting the operational activity, you try to do your best. And of course, at the end, the scientists are involved even to make a paper, but in that moment, you try to do your best, whatever it is. So it's not a coordinated experiment that you design on purpose. Okay, let's put this clearly. But my point is to, of course, you have three ingredients, let me say, basic. Remote sensing is helpful, but of course, as you know, we are much more in favor of polarimetric measurements, SAR measurements, although I understand in some cases it's not easy to have them in a high quality and enough high density, in temporal and spatial density. Then you have some measurements on site, whatever it is, sampling, UAV instruments, which is critical, but of course, this must be coordinated, at least theoretically, monitoring the most critical areas. Think about the Gulf of Mexico. It was kind of gigantic oil spill. You cannot sample at the same moment of the whole area, but you may have some critical area for fishery reason, for environmental reason, whatever. And at the end, you may even benefit of some transportation model. You mentioned this. I don't want to say that on the scientific side. It is on scientific side, anything has pro and cons. But my point is simple. In a real task, okay, I don't want to say operational, but helping the operational guys, how much was your feeling that, let me say, the people on the ground, the real operational, trusted you or the scientists or the remote sensing guys? Because that I want to share my feeling with you. But let me say, you understand, your advice, I don't want to say they are not perfect, they're real, but coming from the model, coming from the sampling, coming from, let me say, some remote sensing analysis, data analysis, which is the real benefit that the people in charge of the operational services trust you, not you personally, of course. I mean, it's a science team, let me say, science team. It may be a COVID issue, but you understand what I mean.
Yeah. Well, we have to take into account the fact that, I came on board 7 years after the spill, and the operational part was over a long time ago.
But Israel was not.
Oh, well, with Israel, because I didn't take part directly. I was not there as well, but they did. There was some kind of information transfer. But I think the point is, and that's kind of what I'm trying to get to in this work, is, we don't need to wait for a spill to create these quantitative frameworks. We can, we had one spill that we finished. Each component knows what they have to do. We know where we take the currents from. We know where we take the winds from. We know how to plug everything in. So once that is done, and there is like active communication between the different components, to do another spill, like to model another spill, will be much faster and much much more fluent. But this type of approach has to be taken in advance. We don't need to wait for an event to occur. We can talk between us, the remote sensing people, the oceanographer, the ecologist, and create a framework that works before there is a spill. And then once there is a spill, we can do that quickly and easily, and provide information for the management, for the decision makers. And I mean, they can use it, they may use it, and they may not use it. That's fine. But at least as scientists, we're doing the best we can to help. If there's no use in that information, at least we provided it. So I think that's kind of my approach. But at least there is a channel of communication between, for example, myself and people in Israel that work on spills, and I think that's I think it can be useful. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Igal.
Thank you so much.
And anyway, we keep in touch. I'll try to talk about more details later on. Thank you very much. Grazie.
Thank you so
everybody.
much.
Thank you, everybody.
It was a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.